Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first episode of the PoliTalk podcast. I'm your host, Haider Malik, and with me, I have the co-host, Alex Hawkins.
Hi.
So today, we're going to start off the first PoliTalk episode discussing the war in Ukraine and its implications on Europe and the rest of the world. So, Alex, could you just talk a little bit about what Keir Starmer and other European leaders are doing in response to Trump's interesting policy decisions?
Basically, after the Munich Security Conference, there was just this general consensus that Europe needed to quote unquote wake up, according to Donald Tusk. Like after World War II, basically Europe has kind of gone soft almost with their military spending and kind of decided that the US would protect them. But all of a sudden, after Donald Trump has kind of shown his true colors, kind of almost siding with Putin, that they've kind of all decided that now's the time where all military spending will start now.
Yeah, I think it's a very important time for Europe and Ukraine as a whole, because now that Donald Trump has made these decisions to essentially let Europe and NATO deal with itself, and NATO relied on the United States so much for its help, it's put Europe in a really tough decision. So what do you think the future of NATO is? And do you think that Donald Trump is true in his decisions, or is this just another one of his deals that he's making?
I think Donald Trump is definitely not. He doesn't intend to completely ostracize the US from NATO, but I think this is just another almost ploy to gain some global power. So I think in this case, it's Trump trying to get closer to Putin and Russia, trying to drive them away from China and kind of keep themselves safe that way. And if the only way to get closer to Putin is to drive away the European NATO countries, that is exactly what he'll do to get there.
Yeah, I think in my opinion that the most crucial thing here is that Trump is afraid of China, and he's afraid of BRICS nations growing up. So to fight against that, he's deciding to not just allow Russia and China to form together and create a new global homogeny that the United States previously had. So he's trying to create influence within Russia. So then Russia and China are not able to work together and overtake US dominance, which is in it of itself, even before Trump, just slowly getting lost. But I think that in response to something very interesting that European leaders are doing, such as Keir Starmer and such as Macron, is they are becoming the new leaders of the free world. So what do you think about this? Do you think that the UK and France can ever become the leaders of the free world, or will it always be the US?
I think it's quite possible that the UK starts to take a bigger role in kind of being a leader of Europe. But in my opinion, I think Macron's France kind of just is not in a good enough position to make any big moves. Like Macron himself is in a precarious position being prime minister himself, and he's looking like he's not going to survive another term. So I think just that kind of turmoil already going through France will kind of bar them from becoming strong enough. But I do think that Keir Starmer is in a good position. I think someone else that also may, start becoming more prominent is Donald Tusk, because he's one of the most recent announcement coming out of Poland is that there will be mandatory military service, increasing their military numbers from 200,000 soldiers to 500,000, which will make it one of, if not maybe top 3 biggest militaries in Europe, which will, there again, in this new age of kind of back to war almost, that will be very, very, very liked. And I think more of Europe will kind of look towards Poland and the UK as leaders of the that being said, new world.
Yeah, but to be honest, I'm not really sure how I feel about this rapid remilitarization of Europe, because in my opinion, at least, I do not think it is likely at all that Russia will truly do anything after they get what they want from Ukraine, just because even though Donald Trump currently is perhaps not as strong in his support to Ukraine that the previous presidents were, I think that if Russia were to invade the rest of Europe, the United States would be forced to do something about it. They would not simply stand idly by, as many left-leaning people are suggesting, that if the rest of Europe was invaded, Donald Trump would just sit back and relax. I don't think that that's something that's going to happen.
I mean, quite literally, he couldn't. I'm pretty sure it's Article 6 of the a NATO agreement that quite literally, it's literally not allowed to not come in support of another member of NATO if they are attacked. So unless the US all of a sudden leaves NATO, which is something that's never ever going to happen, that if you just think about it logically, right? Why would they leave the biggest military pact in the world?
And even if that Article 6 wasn't to exist, I don't think that because it's not just Donald Trump running the entire government. It's a lot more practical people, such as Marco Rubio, who's actually making a lot of good policy decisions, especially regarding China. It's people like those who are going to be more aware of the situation and will be influencing the decisions even more. So I don't think that the situation.
It's just been Marco Rubio's role the entire presidency, just to kind of disagree with everything Trump's saying a little bit, but never say anything enough to kind of mess up the power order. But yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I really don't think it'll ever happen where the US will ever leave NATO or even like infringe on a NATO rule.
And it's not even like Donald Trump is actually doing anything to hurt Ukraine. Like he said that he's going to cut all aid, but then I think like a week later he's already putting aid back into Ukraine, and he was about to almost sign a minerals deal as well, which will likely also get signed in a few weeks after the small dispute between Zelensky is solved. So I think that this is just like Donald Trump has been doing for so many weeks with his tariff policies on Canada and China. He puts Canada and Mexico. He puts them on, then he takes them off, then he puts them on. This is just Donald Trump showing his power. So then when he later implements a new policy, it doesn't seem as bad in comparison, just because the first policy was just so reckless.
I still think, though, that the tariffs he puts on Mexico and Canada are just a bit over the top. That I agree that maybe he'll never do it, but it just makes him sound a little bit less popular as a politician around the world and kind of puts everything he says into like a dubious light.
Yeah, especially because he's not even committing to it. Like perhaps if he did commit to putting full tariffs on all imports from Canada and Mexico, and he continued to implement that, that would eventually probably have some positive implications on the American economy. But what he's doing right now, just going back and forth, is not going to have any positive implications at all, because it's not allowing American manufacturers to actually create things, but it's also not allowing the United States to continue its good relationship that it had with its neighbors on the south and the north.
True. But I think the one benefit of all of this is it kind of just makes Russia kind of look look the US in a better light, that like they're seemingly okay with kind of starting a new world order where it's not necessarily the West versus everyone else, but instead it's like a more, anybody can be partners if they have the right like leverage.
Yeah, I think that that's what Donald Trump is trying to do. He's trying to shift away from like the black and white that the world order was created by ever since like the end of World War II, like the communists versus the capitalists. I think he's trying to shift away from that, especially because he's afraid of what will happen if the anti-West, like the BRICS nations or the axis of resistance, Iran, North Korea, Russia, China, because he's scared of them if they're able to actually consolidate power. So I think that's one of the main reasons, is because he's afraid of what will happen.
And I also feel that like it's also tactical to basically tell Europe that, yeah, you need to start giving a military, because if you think about it that way, that at some point the Europe and US will have better terms, but in this new world where he basically tells everyone he's going to leave, Europe will have, instead of 200,000 troops, 500,000 troops like in Poland, right? That seemingly his plan has theoretically worked perfectly at the expense of his own, popularity as a leader. But maybe that will change in the near future.
Yeah. Another interesting leader that is gaining a lot of popularity right now is Nigel Farage in the United Kingdom. So he, despite only having 3 seats in parliament right now, he is overtaking both the Tories, which is the right-wing party of the United Kingdom, and the Labour Party, the current party in government. He's taking over both of them in polls. So what do you think that says about the future of the UK and Europe as a whole?
I think there again, I think it's questionable if he will ever be prime minister or if his party will ever be majority. But I think what will start to happen is that there will be more, let's say, warning to the right wing, and that the right wing won't just be this like little bug that all the other bigger parties want to stamp out, but instead it'll be something that actually needs to be kind of taken into consideration before an action is made. I mean, as you can see, I think Keir Starmer recently actually has overtaken Nigel Farage again after his leader of the free world stuff, but he's still kind of in a precarious position whilst this other, supposedly the person that was never supposed to have power, is suddenly making a big rise with especially young people in bigger cities. So
yeah, but tying all of this right-wing populism back to the war in Ukraine, which we were discussing previously, I think that this could have a massive implication, just because so much of Europe is currently transitioning towards the right. And I'm honestly, I'm not sure if this is going to be positive or negative for the country of Ukraine, because as you said with Donald Tusk, a right-wing leader, he is all for supporting Ukraine and remilitarizing Europe. But then I think that there are probably other right-wing leaders, specifically such as the AfD in Germany, which are very against using Germany's military to help fight against Russia. So I'm not sure if this rise of the right wing is actually going to help Russia or go against it. It seems like it can sway both ways right now.
I think it depends whether these parties are either like truly nationalists or not. I mean, in terms of Reform UK, I feel that there will be some nationalism within the party, but I also feel like they kind of also understand that the majority of the young people that they have in their party base will be saying, yes, go support Ukraine, because that's kind of, most young people do decide to support, generally, especially in Europe, they support Vladimir Zelensky over Donald Trump, especially in that conflict. So that kind of gets you to believe that, yes, there will be big support for Ukraine in places like the UK. But Donald Tusk himself, actually, and a lot of the Polish people are they're quite against the idea of like an army of Europe, as Zelensky mentioned in the Munich Security Conference, that he kind of talks about Europe having its own military in the same way that like a European Union military, not necessarily Europe. But Donald Tusk was actually one of the main people to be very much against that. So I think as time goes on, it'll just depend how badly it's needed. I don't think most leaders want to, centralize their militaries, but I think it could be possible depending on how strong Russia ends up looking.
Yeah, and I also think that just shows how polarized the United States is. Like, if these absolute far-right parties in countries such as Germany with the AfD or the UK with Reform, if these countries are still not as nationalist as the regular right party in the United States, which is the Republicans, I think that just goes to show how polarized America is and how far right the American right is compared to the European right. Because if any of these European right-wing leaders were to come into power, such as Nigel Farage or such as Marine Le Pen in France, I don't think that their concept of how right or how nationalist would be anywhere near to how far Donald Trump is currently going in his current party. And the same thing goes with the left, I think, in the United States. If the Democrats were to come into power instead, I think that their concept of the left would not be nearly as, it would be even more left than the current left is, such as in the United Kingdom with Keir Starmer, just showing, I think, how far the United States has gone in terms of polarization as compared to the rest of the world.
I mean, and it clearly shows in their foreign policy. It's very clear in their foreign policy how obvious that right wingness is, right? Like that all of a sudden it's Trump's in power and quite literally rewriting the world order, and kind of, it's obviously shocking, but in the US, the people Trump's fans are still very, very much for everything he's doing, regardless of how extreme it is. They will always listen to him. As a news article I read about his, quote, weaving style of speaking, that quite literally anything he says is law to a lot of people in the US. That being said, it's kind of clear that as he continues to make bigger and bigger policies, there will be support behind him because of that just far-right extremism in the US.
I think that also might show a problem with the two-party system that's in the US, because over this summer, we had the UK elections, right? And we switched from a Tory government to a Labour government, and yet we did not see many changes in the foreign policy of the UK. And I think that that's because there are so many parties represented in the parliament in the UK that just one government switch, the prime minister of the country changing, does not allow the entire government and its policies to change to the same extent that it does in the US, where there's just a two-party black or white system where one change in power can completely shift how the government works. And also because of a two-party system, and because people are just around the entire world, people are usually unhappy with the party in power just because they want more out of it for whatever reason. And because the US only has two parties and they keep switching back and forth, the US is just not able to have the same identity that much of Europe does, just because they keep switching between the Democrats and the Republicans, just because of how drastic that change is, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, to be fair, but I think something that will continually happen as time goes on is that Europe and the rest of the world will start to become more like the US in this idea of two-party systems, either far left or far right. Take Germany, for example. The two fastest growing parties are the AfD and Die Linke, the left. Those are the two fastest growing parties, the two most extreme parties. So I think as time goes on, especially in Europe, people will start to become more and more polarized. We're kind of done with the age of the CDUs and the SPDs. It's slightly left, slightly right. I think it'll start going fully right-wing extremism. When that goes badly, left-wing extremism, back and forth, back and forth.
Yeah, and that back and forth is something that's very dangerous. And I think that's a very sad reality if that's actually what we're going towards. Because like I was talking about earlier, in the US with this back and forth, it just makes half the population very unhappy with what's going on in the government at the time. And then when it switches back, the other half is again very unhappy. And the country itself is just so split that they can't make good decisions on anything just because the people are so unhappy with their leader. Just like how 50% of the population of the United States is absolutely devastated at Donald Trump's policies. And then if it were to be Kamala Harris, 50% of the population would be devastated with her policy. So no one's happy in that system.
So I guess the real question is that how would that ever be prevented, right? That even looking at China, you see Xi Jinping quite literally has most people love Xi Jinping. There's never been a poll in China about who loves the prime minister because that's illegal. But if I were to guess, I'd say that Xi Jinping's approval ratings would be extremely high. especially in like bigger cities, because I mean, it's clear that the economic development since he's come into power has been huge, and the people of China are seemingly becoming more and more and more developed. So I don't know. Do you think Xi Jinping would be popular?
I think that there is no opposition, obviously. So there's no one that's actively pointing out the bad things that he's doing, which you see in other democratic countries in the world. Like when one leader does something, then the opposition is always ready to criticize them at any given moment. But there's no one to do something like that for Xi Jinping just because it's a one-party system. So I think that obviously because of that, people do not have much of a bad impression about Xi Jinping, and also because of the active, crazy amount of censorship that happened in China regarding him, just like we saw, like when people thought that he was like Winnie the Pooh, then Winnie the Pooh got banned in China just because of that. So there's like no idea of anything bad regarding Xi Jinping. So I think that in the minds of the Chinese people, there's no alternative, and he is the chosen leader. They only see good things about him. So I don't think that they can think bad things about him. But I think that if an opposition were to exist, and if China were to be a democracy, then perhaps it would be different. Because I mean, we just don't know what bad things Xi Jinping has done just because the censorship is so good.
Yeah, ironically, is that almost more efficient if you think about it? A lot of the time, the reason why a lot of these countries in Europe or a lot of these democracies become so inefficient to an extent is that idea where it's like 50% of the population is devastated with everything they do. In the next election, there are just enough people that thought, oh, those guys was bad. Let's switch over to the next party. And it's kind of this back and forth ping pong game where you just erase everything the last people did because that's all the people are telling you to do. So maybe
Yeah.
honestly, the European idea of just like coalitions and stuff may be the play, but as you can see, people seemingly don't want that they're done voting for these centrist parties and instead are going all in for the far left, far right.
But then the problem with that, as you said, with going all in, especially, I mean, maybe in like 20, 30 years, we'll see it where there's only the far right and the far left, as you said, with a two-party system in the rest of Europe. But right now, what's going to happen is there's going to be, there's going to have to be coalition parties because so many new parties will pop up. And then effectively, nothing will be able to get done because either the coalition will be mixed between a far right and far left, which obviously nothing can get done with that, or a government will have to be formed by a bunch of smaller parties, such as in Germany, the CDU might have to make a coalition with the Green Party, which in and of itself is just a contradiction because the Green Party is advocating for like absolutely open borders, whereas the CDU wants to take a stricter approach. So if things like that continue to happen and coalitions like that continue to be formed, then just nothing is going to effectively going to happen in these countries. And that's another problem, like with the ping pong thing you were talking about earlier, where leaders are forced to just keep switching between the other parties. That's a massive problem for a lot of third world countries today, which just decided to go into democracy without even really thinking about it, and then nothing's able to get done because the leaders cannot do anything because they just have to keep switching power, and then the next leader erases everything they've done, which just puts them in a cycle of these third world countries, puts them in a cycle of not being able to develop.
I was watching a video recently actually about the president of the DRC and just how obscene his like the extravagance of all of his activities are. And it makes me wonder how long will it be until it's another one, like somebody very similar to him, because the whole history of the DRC and Rwanda and the Congo War is that like basically it was a puppet of the of Rwanda basically came into power in the DRC, and then all of a sudden that guy turned on Rwanda and there was the big war, and then all of a sudden it's the exact same situation where the DRC and Rwanda are fighting again, two countries that were once friends. So I just kind of question, will that ever happen in Europe, where it's singular big powers kind of coming into power, and then all of a sudden they get toppled by a smaller party that all of a sudden gains super traction because of how terrible the one leader is. That's it.
Yeah, I find it interesting that you're talking about Rwanda right now because I think that Rwanda is one example of a country that didn't just randomly adopt democratic policies just because they thought it would be successful because of that ping pong stuff we were talking about earlier. And then like Paul Kagame, the leader of Rwanda, he imposed like semi-authoritarian policies, and that's the reason why Rwanda was able to be so successful is because they didn't just blindly adopt democracy. Now Rwanda is one of the most economically developed countries in the entire continent of Africa because they didn't just blindly implement democratic policies, which is the trap that a lot of third world countries fall into, I think.
True. It kind of gets me to think that at what stage is a democracy kind of viable? That like if even some of the most powerful nations in the world can't sustainably keep a democracy, at what stage does a democracy become efficient? Is it like, I guess it's the midpoint, the just after development, then you can have a democracy.
Yeah, but then what's the alternative? Like, what would you suggest instead for countries like the United States, where democracy evidently isn't working out for most of the population?
I guess you assume. I think something that would actually help the U.S. quite a lot is 8-year terms instead of 4-year terms, because it's long enough where you kind of are forced to, you make that choice before that 8 years, and after that you kind of just live through that government, right? That after 8 years, most of the projects will be done, set up by that government, and if you can't just finish something that's already been fully created, right? So it kind of allows these new governments to kind of flesh out what they're doing, but it still kind of leaves the opportunity for a new president to be put in. I don't know. What do you think of that idea?
The only thing I think about an 8-year term is if a president is successful and if people like him and if he's doing good things to help the country, then he's going to get elected for a second term anyway, and therefore will have 8 years as president. Like Obama, he had 8 years because at the end of his first term, people liked him. People wanted him to continue to stay in power. But on the opposing side, Donald Trump, after his first term, people didn't like him. People didn't want him in power. And that's why he got voted out and didn't get to run for a second term in a row. So I think that 8-year term kind of just plays out in itself if that leader is successful and if people like him. But if they don't like him, then that leader gets to leave because the people don't like him. And I think 8 years, like just 8 years without any election in the middle, that could lead to leaders just eventually doing nothing. Like after 3 years, I guess they've already been in power so long. Then what do they do after that? Especially if they're incredibly unpopular, then I just think that people become unhappy, and it's very easy to just fall into a lot of dangerous traps for a country.
True. I don't know. I just think 4 years sometimes is too short. That it's often you kind of go back to that ping pong game. It's a lot harder to play ping pong when the timing is doubled between each hit. Yeah, I guess. Do you think Donald Trump will ever change the Constitution? And if he does, where he can run for a third term, will he win the next election?
I think he would want to change the Constitution, obviously, but I don't think that he would get approval from everyone. He wouldn't get approval from the Senate to change it just because most of the people in the Senate are a lot more sane than him. And I think that if he were to theoretically change it, it really depends on who the Democrats put out as a candidate. I think there's a lot of very weak candidates that Democrats continue to put out, just like with Hillary Clinton. She was an incredibly weak candidate, and yet the Democrats decided to have her as a Democratic nominee instead of someone brilliant, such as Bernie Sanders. And I think that was a very weak move for the Democrats, and it spoiled their future for a long time. So I think if the Democrats were to put someone like that, then it could have a very dangerous, that could be a very easy way for Trump to continue to consolidate his power. But I think that it also depends on what Trump does in the next 3 years of his presidency. If he continues to do the crazy stuff that he's been doing until now, I don't think that the average person is going to continue to vote for him. Just like there's so many people, just like you, for example, who liked Trump, or not liked him, but liked him more than they liked Kamala at the beginning of the term. But after seeing what his policies have been doing, you would probably not vote for him if the election would happen again today, right?
True. I'd say that being said, though, I think if the Democrats can get a better leader, I think they will be in a much, much better position, because ever since Obama, they kind of have not been able to get their footing. Hillary Clinton obviously was notoriously disliked, followed by Joe Biden, who had a decent run at the beginning, but as just time went on, it was clear that he was not fit to lead the country. And that leaves Kamala Harris, who, there again, she just, number one, did not have enough time, and number two, was too extreme for the American public, that most people could not decide to vote for her other than young people who really want a big amount of change. But that's just not the majority of American people. So I think we just need a new Obama being the most popular Democrat of all time, right? But we just need somebody that is charismatic and willing to fight Trump on his ideals and his tactics, yet not be the only thing that they are being against Trump, like Kamala Harris was.
Yeah, I think that Joe Biden, he was definitely a very strong candidate, but it was just his age that was a problem, I guess. Yeah. And the thing with Kamala, I think, as you were saying, like, she made it very hard to vote for her if you weren't in that specific people that she was trying to advocate for, like the younger liberal people. Those are the people that she was trying to show her campaign off to. And if you weren't part of that very specific group, that group that was on TikTok following Kamala HQ and all that stuff, then it was hard to vote for her. And I think that might have been one of her biggest mistakes, is making her voter base so small and the people that she advertised to so small, because all those liberal people were going to vote for her anyway. So maybe she should have advertised to a more diverse set of people that were potentially like in between voting for her or Trump.
Yeah. Do you think the Democrats will have a good opportunity to have like find a new leader soon? Are there any possible like leading candidates?
I don't know enough about like domestic American politics, but the only person I can think of right now is perhaps Tim Walz. I think he was very popular. He was potentially more popular than Kamala Harris in the Democratic election. And obviously, there's always Bernie Sanders sitting at the back. His age is the only problem right now. But I think that if they find like a younger version of Bernie Sanders who wants to implement these more socialist economic policies, but doesn't really care much about the the social side of it and the stuff that a lot of people didn't like Kamala Harris of because of her wokeness. And a leader like Bernie Sanders doesn't really talk much about that. He talks more about his economic policies, which I think is more of what the American people want right now.
True. I think it's possible. The Democrats have always had this history of they always eventually do find a suitable leader, but it's just a matter of time. That they need to find their new Obama that can lead the people and kind of bring them together.
Yep. Okay, so I think that's it for today for our podcast. Unless you have any final words, Alex.
Nope.
Okay, so thank you for listening, and remember to follow PoliTalk and stay tuned for more podcast episodes coming soon. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.